Across now, live and exclusive to the Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, one of our top economists, Sanjeev Sanyal. He's been involved very closely in the drafting of the financial stimulus package. Mr. Sanyal, welcome to India today. I want to start by asking you why it took so long for the government to announce that even those who don't have ration cards will be given food supplies from the government PDS quota, the likes of Raghuram Rajan, Abhijit Banerjee, Arvind Subramaniam. We've been suggesting this for 7 weeks now. You were hearing that idea. It's great that you've finally done it. Could this have been done earlier, Mr. Sanyal? Welcome.
Actually, from what I understand, the states were given, carte blanche to pick up grains from the center's food stocks right from the beginning. But nevertheless, I mean, if you needed further impetus, which has now been given, but it's not the case that we did not have a system of doing so. If an NGO or a state agency of some sort wanted grains from the center's food stocks, there were already an existing arrangement for doing that, from what I understand.
So the other big idea today is of a one nation, one ration card. But this was first announced by the UPA government way back in 2012, then by Ramvilas Paswan as Consumer Affairs Minister in 2019 in the middle of the year, and was to be implemented by June 2020. So it's not a new idea. It's been in the pipeline for a while. We're also in the midst of a health emergency. How will you facilitate this and enable this, and by when do you think the idea of one nation, one ration card will be a reality?
Well, I think the Finance Minister made the point that it will take some time, in the sense that some part of it will get done quite quickly, but obviously it is a logistical issue in the middle of this situation. So it will take, say, till March of 2021. So in some ways, it's a good infrastructure being built out, but some part of it will hopefully get done soon enough. And already arrangements are being made that even without this unified card, you are able, as we were just discussing, you are able to allow people to lift ration from places other than where their ration cards are registered. So we are doing that, but yes, a more regularized system will fully get done by March of 2021.
One of the big demands has been that we transfer 6,000 rupees into the bank accounts of farmers under the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Yojana, that amount should be increased, that for the full year, 6,000 rupees, given the acute distress, is not much. You pushed in some advances in the first round. There's a demand that be increased further to up to about 10,000 rupees or so at the least. Are you thinking about that? Can we expect that in the next 3 tranches?
So we have obviously received a lot of suggestions, and we are considering it. As you know, today was only the second of the various tranches of stimulus that were being announced. We have several more tranches to be announced. So just bear with us as we take you through these tranches. They are, as you can see, fairly detailed. Many of them are highly targeted. So, it is important that we go through this step by step.
The other key expectation was that the government would transfer income, provide income support, wage support to small companies, especially who are unable to pay their employees. The approach seems to have been that let's give credit, ensure liquidity so that companies keep running and they will hopefully take care of employees. Now that doesn't provide immediate income support that lakhs of workers, laborers, people in small companies in the organized and unorganized sector are desperately hoping for. Some countries have done that. Is that still in the pipeline? Can we expect that, or is that an idea you're ruling out?
So first of all, for the formalized workers, this already exists because, as you know, the central government will pick up for the EPF contributions. So that is already, in a sense, that exactly the same thing. But it is obviously much more difficult to implement that with informal workers and with contract labor. So we have had to do it in a different way, which is to provide it to the companies and then protect them and provide them with credit and liquidity so that they keep these informal workers employed for as long as possible. But of course, we are always open to suggestions. So we are happy to look into any other way of doing this. But we have done this in a way for the formalized workers, as you may know.
Sir, but when we spoke to those who run micro, small and medium enterprises after the finance minister announced the package, some of the feedback was that what you are giving right now is credit, which will have to be repaid after a certain while and on which interest will be charged. Whereas the key challenge is, will those small companies start their factories, produce products unless they are assured of demand? What is the government doing to address the demand challenge? It's demand that's crashed. How do you hope to revive demand?
I think there are different problems that need to be solved. It is not the case that you do not need to solve the credit problem. So there is a demand issue. But remember, not all demand is business to consumer. A lot of the demand is business to business. There are issues about tackling the payments and making sure that they are liquid and are able, for example, to pay salaries, which we just talked about. So I think the issue here is to thinking about demand in a silo is completely wrong. Providing credit and liquidity is also part of bolstering demand, as indeed is the case of providing support to NBFCs and others and making sure that the credit market works, because this is not a closed system where demand is provided at one end and credit is provided at other end. They're all integrated, flowing from each other. The credit creates the demand, incidentally, at multiple levels, whether it's B2B or even B2C. A lot of that comes from credit. So I think this idea that you create demand and one hand and credit at another hand and they're separate issues is completely wrong way of thinking about it.
I'm not taking anything away from the need to create credit, to provide credit. I'm asking you, how do you hope to stimulate demand?
No. This is not the way to think about it. No serious economist or even, by the way, business will take this up. I've talked to, literally hundreds of businessmen before we came up with this package. And since then, I also have talked to a lot. I think everybody appreciates that credit was an extremely important blockage that we had to make sure worked. There's a lot of appreciation for the guarantee scheme. Maybe other things need to be done. And as you know, we haven't finished with all our tranches. But to say that somehow credit is unlinked to demand is completely untenable.
Okay, let's deal with some of the structural reform that the Prime Minister spoke about. Land reform, labour reform, administrative reform. I'll start with land. The last time the government tried to push through land reform, there was a major blowback. Provisions of the Land Acquisition Act were diluted and the government basically developed cold feet. People who are listening to these pronouncements will wonder, how do we know for sure that if the announcements are made and pushed through, that the government will stay the course?
Obviously, all the factors of production are important. As far as land is concerned, incidentally, a lot of it will have to be done by the states, and some of the states are already beginning to move on that. But you have substantial movements on the labour front. 3 major states have announced labour reforms and their intention to go forward with them. And today, by the way, the Finance Minister did announce the outline of the labour reforms that we intend to put through. Some of it is already, incidentally, in the pipeline. They were already, before this crisis hit us, there were 44 laws had been put down to 4. And by the way, it's not just the case that we are easing it up from the perspective of business and employers. For the employees as well, there is enhanced protection, for example, for safety, which is important. There is also an effort to formalize them by making sure that every employee gets a appointment letter. These are all important, by the way, because as we just discussed, if you have an employment letter, then you know who is in the formal system and you can actually provide the direct support of the kinds that people are talking about. If you don't have a formalized system, it's impossible to do that. So all of this is indeed being done. And as I said, some of the states have already taken the lead, but the central government already had collapsed 44 laws into 4. And some of them, and in fact all of them, are in the process in the parliament.
But these ordinances are being questioned. The timing pushed through at a time of immense economic distress, where you'd expect that the government enhances the kind of support and the kind of protection the employees get, rather than take away some of the protections they enjoy?
So I think you have, that's not at all the case. Those who are questioning it, I'm happy to debate them. But the fact of the matter is, if you want enhanced employment generation and attract investment, then clearly we need to do labor reforms. I don't think there's any serious economist in the last 30 has not argued for labor reforms. Now, when we are beginning to do this, suddenly people pop up and say, oh, you know, this should not be done. Why not? Why was, you know, it's not like we have an employment crisis that has just emerged. We had serious issues with our labor laws for decades, and everybody argued we had to do something about it. Now we are doing it. Now you have objections that, oh, it's just bad timing. You've got to be kidding me. Why?
Okay, for what it's worth, and I know you're a technocrat, so you'll dodge the curveball, but I'll throw it nonetheless. The RSS's affiliate, the Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, has said that there will be a national agitation in opposition to the Uttar Pradesh scrapping of the laws on labor, saying that this is inhuman, we are going back to medieval times. So you will find opposition not just from the Congress and the left, but from within the Sangh fraternity as well.
So, as I said, I don't answer questions politically on political issues. That is for the political class to answer. But I think this issue of labor laws has been long debated for decades. And incidentally, I can tell you that having grown up in Kolkata, these labor laws have never protected labor. They were mostly to protect, since you're talking about politics, they were mostly to protect labor union leaders and enhance their power. So, I mean, look at what happened to the industrial base of West Bengal over the decades in which these labor laws were imposed. You know, much of this migration problem you are seeing is partly because these labor laws forced people to move to those parts of the country which had easier labor laws. So I don't think this is even a tenable argument. But yes, I mean, if there are political frictions as a result, that is for the...
Okay. One of the key challenges at this moment is to revive industry. Industry requires employees, laborers, workers, many of whom are now making their long way back home in pretty abysmal conditions. How do you reconcile the idea that you're trying to get industry up and running at a time when a lot of the workers in those industries are back home or on their way back home?
Certainly, this is an issue that obviously needs to be taken seriously. We don't want large numbers of people clearly walking along our highways. So therefore, as you know, the railways has opened up special trains for them. The central government is picking up 85% of the cost of that. And on request of state governments, they are being provided where they want. And I think the finance minister did read out a list of states and how many trains they had requested. And then the state government picks up 15%. So there is no question about, this not being a serious issue. We obviously do take it as a serious issue. But then you're right, as and when the industry begins to open up, they will want some of their labor to come back. And then in which case we will also have another reverse migration there as well.
But a lot of the workers are saying, you may have heard those comments on television, that they don't want to come back, that they've been so bitterly disappointed with their experience that at this moment at least they're saying they don't want to come back.
So this is precisely where are these workers from? Where most of them are from, for example, the state of Uttar Pradesh. And it would be wonderful if we could provide them good jobs nearer to home. And you know for a fact that the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh has been totally at the forefront of these reforms for precisely this reason. There is a very good reason why we want to do labor reforms in these states, because this is where you will generate jobs on the basis of these. And by the way, let me repeat, most of these labor laws did not protect labor. We have had these kinds of stringent labor laws for years and decades. You would have thought that our labor conditions in India would have been, the world's best if these labor laws were so good. The point is that they were basically led to a lot of rigidities, often to rent seeking at the ground level. And of course, most importantly, they didn't protect the worker at all. There was a huge amount of informality. Safety rules were unclear and often unimplemented. These are the things we need to be serious about. Formalize them, provide them with proper safety, and I think the Finance Minister mentioned this very clearly just a little while ago. And then, but on the other hand, create flexibility. We have to have a reasonable system by which employers will come in there and employ them in states where the origin states are.
Beyond the rhetoric, what's the government's construct of an Atmanirbhar Bharat? How is the Modi idea of self-reliance different from the Nehruvian idea of self-reliance, which the people of India have heard for 70 years now?
Well, I think I have said this on your channel before. It's a completely different idea. This is not, Atmanirbhar Bharat is not about a return to Nehruvian import substitution. The Prime Minister made that very clear. He mentioned repeatedly that he was very keen in participating in global supply chains. I think he used the word supply chain repeatedly through the course of his speech. So there is no question about that. This is not an India that is under the impression that the rest of the world is sleeping just because it's midnight in India. We want to be a part of the rest of the world, and we will participate in it. But we will participate in it on our terms. And we have an economically decentralized and localized. I think that was also mentioned. So this is fundamentally different again from the idea of centralized, the commanding heights telling you through permits and licenses how the economy will function through some sort of a bureaucratic diktat. That is not the case at all. The idea here is to, in fact, through a series of reforms, make the economy more flexible, encourage the small and medium-sized industry, and really go for an economy that is internationally competitive, and in particular is able to participate in a post-COVID supply chain, which is obviously liquefying rapidly, and we can definitely insert ourselves into it.
But a lot of the premise is predicated around the idea that manufacturing is desperate to move out of China. You would have seen the report that came from the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, where they asked their members, are you looking to move manufacturing out of China? To which 70% of the companies said no, only 4% said yes. Out of that 4%, it's very difficult for India to get some of those companies. What makes you so confident that manufacturing will move out of China at a time when most of the companies can actually come to the conclusion that they were able to get their manufacturing lines up and running faster in China than anywhere else?
First of all, let me say that, our conclusions are not drawn on surveys. We talk to industry all over the world, and we are in touch with many of them, and not just in the world, but our own industry is keen to scale up, and you've seen that just in the last few weeks. When the world wanted, drugs and medicine, our industry was able to respond quite quickly, and we were able to provide all kinds of generic drugs at a very competitive price all over the world. However, we also want to be sure the supply chains of inputs into these industries, like the pharmaceuticals industries, are secure in that, we should never be in a position again where we are suddenly hit by a shock and our supply chains begin to break down. So resilience of the supply chain is a very important part of how we think about Atmanirbhar Bharat.
You keep mentioning global supply chains. Let's just delve into that for a moment. One, of course, is pharmaceuticals, where it's a strategic area. You don't want to be dependent on countries like China. But let's take advanced technologies, where there are deeply complex global value chains, and only parts are manufactured in certain countries. The entire product is just too complex to manufacture in any one country. At a time when we're dealing with economic nationalism, putting up trade walls, and saying that, okay, come manufacture in India, how do we then become a part of a very complex global value chain?
Of course, that's precisely the reason I said this is not about going out there and recreating Nehruvian import substitution. I think I made that clear. So therefore, we are clearly not thinking in those lines at all. We are thinking of participating, and that requires that we attract FDI. We also means that we scale up our own companies in order to be able to supply the rest of the world. And yes, we have been successful in many areas. After all, we are now the world's second largest mobile phone manufacturer. We were nowhere in the scene just a few years ago. So it is not the case that we are unable to attract global business to India. We have done it in the past. And there are other industries as well where we have global chains for scale, for example, in automobiles and other things. So it is the case that we can participate in global supply chains, and we will. There is a clearly rejigging of global supply chains happening, irrespective of what some survey may have said, because we are directly in touch with the industries and in discussions with them. So we know what they are thinking quite from the horse's mouth. And so we will pursue this. And by the way, it's not just about foreign companies coming and doing FDI. One of the things the Prime Minister made very clear was that we need to think about creating Indian brands, local brands, and taking them global. So we have to be confident enough to thinking of this in the other way around as well. Why should we always think that, participating in global supply chains is about an MNC, a foreign MNC? What about our own MNCs, or scaling up our relatively small companies to much larger size?
Now, speaking of bigger companies in India, the focus so far has been on micro, small and medium enterprises. The big boys of India Inc. are wondering, "Hamara kya hoga?" They're also feeling the pain, and they're saying that the MSMEs are actually at the end of the value chain, where the big companies give the orders which are executed by the micro companies and the small companies. Their concern is if they start going under, then over a period of time, there won't be too many orders going out to the small companies.
Of course, we appreciate that, as I said right in the beginning, that the economy cannot be thought of in silos, and we have to think of it in a much broader way, in that everything feeds into everything else. The smaller companies feed into the larger companies sell products to the workers of smaller companies, and so on and so forth. So we clearly need to provide support to all sides of the economy, and some more is in the subsequent tranches will deal with some of these issues. But let me, in this context, say there are certain systemic issues that we need to take care of as well. For example, we need to slowly and steadily lower the cost of capital in this country. The Reserve Bank, of course, has done some part in having lowered the policy rates, but the transmission of that still needs to be cleaned up. And we are doing some of that for the SMEs, but I think a overall lowering of the cost of capital, including, by the way, the cost of borrowing of the government itself, needs to take place. And we are nudging interest rates overall downwards, so that.
But is this in some ways just kicking the football down the ground? Because if you, for example, give credit guarantees which are to be repaid after a certain period of time, could you be creating a potential bad loan problem just going forward? So
this is precisely
pushing
why
the inevitable.
So no, it's not inevitable. That's why we spent a fair amount of thought on how to go about it. We are not just going out and say anybody who thinks he wants a loan, turn up. No, this 3 lakh crore is being given as an extension, 100% guaranteed extension, but an extension to the limits that already exist. So in a sense, these companies already exist. They have a credit record, and the banks are being now told, look, if you expand their credit limits, we will give you 100%. So these are, they may be at the margin, some companies going wrong, but by and large, these are functioning companies with real businesses, and they have a credit record. So we have taken care to try and limit that. And by the way, there are also some companies which may not be able to, may have had some problem in relatively recent past. For them also, we have made some provision. Indirectly, separately, we have also created ways of getting liquidity to NBFCs, so that when they go out, after all, there are parts of the economy where the formal banking system doesn't reach, but the NBFCs do. So then again, we put in the effort of creating a buyer of SPV, so to make sure that the credit market also functions. So all of these are aimed ultimately in making sure that credit and liquidity does go through to the wider economy, and that's the way you essentially ensure that payments continue to happen, to the extent possible jobs are protected, and so on and so forth. So this is an important part of that demand protection that you were talking about. Otherwise, what will happen is you will get cascades of downgrades and defaults and so on. So what we are doing is trying to head that off with making sure there's adequate credit and liquidity in the system.
Now, one of the key reasons that we are pushing through land and labor reform is the hope that this will give an uptick to investment. But at a time when there's already excess capacity and companies are worried about survival, do you really think that in the short to medium term there will be an increased investment appetite, because we are changing some policy, which is great. The fact that this is long pending, it's good that we are doing it, but will it have the impact that we were hoping?
So first of all, we are not going to eternally remain in lockdown. So we have to begin to think about the post-lockdown world, and essentially all investment always is based on prospective demand projections. They are not meant on the demand projections of right now. Of course, in a lockdown that is the case. But are you suggesting that we will never ever go back and purchase cars or go back and purchase cell phones and so on? Of course, consumer behavior and taste may change, but technologies will change, opportunities will change. We are a very large internal market. I think Prime Minister again made that point. We have the demographics, and our internal market is still very under penetrated. There are large parts of the country which haven't bought their first refrigerator. There are many places where we still need people want to buy their first home. So I don't think in that sense, in the medium term sense, there is a fundamental lack of demand in India. The question is to make sure that industry survives this period and is there on the other side to be able to deal and supply this demand. Why is this important? Because if you see, if there is a supply side destruction, i.e. our industrial base breaks down right now, then the real problem will be when this demand comes back, we will ironically end up having inflation. So we will end up with having excess capacity, and then we will not have any capacity, and then you will have inflation when that demand comes back. So we have to protect the industrial capacity through this sharp downturn, which is temporary. I don't think it's going to last for very long. It's difficult to say how long, but I don't think it'll last so long that it fundamentally changes the underlying demand dynamics of this country for all time to come. And therefore, I don't think it also changes the medium to long-term investment horizon either. And yes, if we have done the reforms, if we made capital cheap, and of course, cheapness of capital matters a lot, because that is the present value of everything is dependent on that, and then the discounting rate is the interest rate.
Have you done any calculations on how much loss the Indian economy has suffered as a consequence of this lockdown? I'm reading an interview given by Subhash Chandra Garg, the former Economic Affairs Secretary, who says that the loss to the GDP already is, in his estimate, at about 20 lakh crore rupees, which is twice the amount of the stimulus that we're providing.
I'm glad he has come up with these estimates. I'm sure many others have. And I'd be quite interested to see, because quite frankly, we are in an evolving situation, and it was, let's say, a very brave person who would put such hard numbers to it. The numbers are significant, I do not deny that, but to put hard numbers down like that, it is quite amusing.
One of the key challenges is to inspire confidence. At a time when companies are laying off, and the government has invoked the National Disaster Management Act, but those companies which are under distress don't particularly care about the consequences, saying, "Hum hi nahi bachenge, to hum employee ko kya bachayenge?" They're retrenching people left, right and center. So, A, how do you deal with that challenge? B, when people know that they're not going to get any appraisals, they probably may have to deal with a salary cut, they're not going to go out and start consuming non-essentials. They'll buy just what they need, and a lot of non-essential purchases may be pushed for later. So how do you then kickstart the engines of the economy in such a situation?
So you're absolutely right. There is anxiety in the economy, and it shouldn't be surprising. And we have gone through a extremely unusual situation. Perhaps since the Great Depression and the Second World War, we haven't had such a major global shock. And it's not just about domestic consumers. Our export markets too have gone through a sharp downturn. Having said that, there are many areas where, as I said, at least in domestically, there are many underserved parts of the economy. And while in the short run we will have difficulty, medium term I'm quite confident that these demand for many of these products will come back. I mean, and if we are able to put through together enough of a stimulus, and we are putting in fairly significant amounts of money to play, as you have seen, then the spiral downwards will turn into a spiral upwards. These things feed on themselves. So I don't think, unless this COVID situation carries on for years on end, which I doubt, you will get some pain, and then we will unwind back to some trajectory. It will be an upward pointing trajectory. I think it would be a very, very brave person to say that Indians will permanently stop consuming because we went through a lockdown for a few months in the year 2020.
No, sure, that's nobody's case. But the question is, what kind of a trajectory will it be? Will it be a V-shaped recovery, which is a quick, fast, sharp recovery? Will it be a W-shaped recovery, which includes a second dip?
We can't
Will it
predict
be L-shaped?
Well, it depends on how many, there are so many moving parts, the exact trajectory is impossible. I'm sure Mr. Garg will have a good estimate of it. You can ask him.
Okay, great, thanks. This has been an engaging conversation. Sanjeev Sanyal, for joining us with your thoughts and very clear insights into what you're making of the financial package that's been rolled out by the government so far. Thank you very much for your time. We hope to have you back as we hear more from the government on what's being planned. Sanjeev Sanyal there. I want to tell our viewers that in a short while from now, in about 19 minutes from now, we'll have former Finance Minister and one of the biggest voices on Indian economics, Mr. P. Chidambaram, joining us live on India Today. He'll present a counter. We've heard so far from Prakash Javadekar, we've heard from Sanjeev Sanyal. At 8 p.m. we'll hear tonight from Union Telecom and Law Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad. But at 7 p.m. we'll hear from Mr. P. Chidambaram. What does the Congress's former Finance Minister make of the government's approach to handling this crisis? I'm slipping into a break. I'll have more for you on the other side when we come back. Stay with us.